Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sustainable Finance and Investment Seminar. As you probably know, my name is So-Young, and I am your host for this seminar series. For your background, I am a faculty member at the Korea Advanced Institute for Science and Technology, called KAIST, and also an affiliate fellow at the Stanford Center for Sustainable Development and Global Competitiveness. This monthly seminar series is a collaborative effort between Stanford University's Sustainable Finance Initiative, SFI, and KAIST Graduate School on Green Growth and Sustainability. So each month, we explore a wide range of the topics in sustainable finance and investment. And then we are delighted to have you all here as our audience continues to grow globally. Today, I am delighted to have our guest speaker, Professor Ki-Young Park. He's a professor at the School of Economics at Yonsei University and also a former member of the Monetary Policy Board at the Bank of Korea, which plays a role similar to the Federal Reserve Board in the US. Throughout his career, he advised on the monetary policy in various capacities, including serving on Korea's National Economic Advisory Board and also Advisory Board for Foreign Reserve Portfolio Management and Monetary Policy Board at the Bank of Korea. He holds his PhD in econ from the University of Chicago. If you are asking my personal opinion or perspective on his work or his career, he's one of my favorite central banker or former central banker who brings all those inspiring perspective on the monetary policy and the work of the central bank. Those topics include household debt, housing prices, digital finance, or like those advancement on digital technology and its intersection of monetary policy and financial innovation, and of course climate change that the central banks are confronting today. And then the work that he's going to be presenting today is one of the, as far as my best knowledge, was the kind of like a very early on that the central bank is doing on the climate stress testing. It was actually the collaborative work between Professor Park and me. And then when we started this work, we noticed that the publicly available studies were only done by the UK and France and Netherlands. So we had very much fun, like leading this work. At the same time, he's continuously brings, like further topics to the Bank of Korea and also other central bank and financial regulatory entities on climate change. So I'm not gonna spoil any of the contents of his presentation today. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Ki-Young. Ki-Young, please take your stage.
Oh, thank you for the kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be here at Stanford and KAIST joint seminar. I'm Ki-Young Park from Yonsei University. So as the Professor Yin said, in my talk today, I will present an example of climate stress test performed by the central bank. Specifically, it was performed by me and Professor So-Young and the Bank of Korea in 2020, and we did it once more in 2023 with the updated scenario. And in today's talk, rather than explaining every detail, I would like to present a rough picture on why we need this and how we do this. So I look forward to the discussion ahead and welcome your insight as we engage in this conversation. So here's the roadmap. So let me just briefly talk about the background and I will introduce the concept and differences with the typical stress test performed in financial sector. And also I will briefly present the result from the BOK's climate stress test. And this is just one of them. So recently, the Bank of Korea devoted itself in research in climate change, and then they come up with many new models and new research. So this is just the part of the effort by the Bank of Korea. And here's the typical disclaimer. So anything I say today is on my own, and it's not for the Bank of Korea. So let me start with these three questions. So first one is that why does or why should the central bank care about climate risk? And second, in what ways? And personally, I think the climate stress test is the one good example how the central bank engages itself in addressing the climate change. And third question is that should addressing climate change is the part of the central bank's mandate? So my personal answer is no at this stage. So I hope that end of this seminar that we have a rough answer to these three questions. So this is the purpose of my presentation today. So let me just go into the background. So there are some famous quotes on climate change from central bank community. So one example is the climate Minsky moment and tragedy of the horizon, coined by Mark Carney. And he's the former governors of Bank of England and Bank of Canada, and he's expected to be the prime minister in a few days for the Canada. And another one is the green swan. So I expect that many of us understand what this means, and let me just briefly explain these terms. So when we talk about the tragedy of the horizon, so we said that the serious effects of climate change are actually unfolding over much longer horizon, so that the present generation care less about this problem, and actually we impose more burden to the future the generation, which means that the inadequate preparation between the current generation and future generation. And another term by the green swan means that this is related to our climate stress test today, and this term is the financial crisis caused by climate change, and the Bolton argues that we need to prepare, especially the central bank should play the role of the climate rescue of the rest of the region in the future. So all this concept is about the relatively new recognition of the seriousness of climate change in central bank community. And also, I do not visit this website, and this is the survey by the Chicago Booth Business School, and they ask about in the case for the European Central Bank, and the central bank should consider the environmental things in their mandate, and we have the rising positive answers on this question. So in central bank community, we have a rising awareness of the risk in the climate change, and also that's why we formed the NGFS. This is the network for greening the financial system. So this is kind of the gathering of central bank and financial supervisories to address the climate change. So it started in 2017, and for now we have more than 100 member countries, and the Bank of Korea joined in 2019. And notably and interestingly, the Fed actually announced to quit the NGFS this January by saying that they broadened in scope and covering a wide range of issues that are outside of the Fed statutory mandate. So I partially agree with this statement, but it is very interesting that the Fed announced to quit just 3 days before the President Trump took the office. So it's very interesting, and then I don't know why in detail. And let me just briefly talk about the situation in South Korea. So it's very simple. So in terms of fiscal risk, the South Korea is okay, but in terms of transition risk, we face enormous problem and challenges. So according to German Watch, so they say that in terms of fiscal risk, the South Korea is ranked in 108th in the world. So we can say that we are relatively safe in terms of fiscal risk, but in terms of the transition risk, we have serious problem. So for example, according to Climate Change Response Index survey, the South Korea ranked the 63rd, and this is kind of the bottom among this survey. And so we have serious problem. And also recently, we have many ongoing discussion about carbon border adjustment mechanism, especially discussed in Europe area. And as we know, the South Korea is rely very much on export. So this is very key issue in South Korea these days. And let me just so I will go a little more detail about climate stress test, but let me just quote a few remarks about climate stress test. So there's many serious threats to the humanity, including climate change and asteroid pandemic and nuclear wars. But the Stern emphasized that the climate change is distinguished from other problems in that it is very long-term and persistent and irreversible and uncertain. And the climate stress actually take these four properties into their model. So we have very serious and difficult the modeling problem. But despite of these difficulties, the climate stress test provide the what-if framework to estimate the effect of future climate risk on the finance sector. So I think that this sentence will summarize the current status of the climate stress. So some numbers can be better than no number. So as emphasized by the NGFS, so it says that central bank need to take the proactive and exemplary approach, and the climate stress is one of the example that the central bank can contribute. So, and in today's talk, I will talk about some weakness or the shortcomings in climate test. So we have far more way to go, and climate stress testing is a new and developing field. So we have much room to improvement. And through the climate stress test, so what can we expect? Then we can say that as some numbers can be better than no numbers, we can prepare. So central bank can raise the awareness of the seriousness of climate change, and we can actually distribute that information so that the individual companies and private financial institutions can evaluate and prepare accordingly. So as Bolton said, the main purpose of climate stress test is not to get the exact number, and is to make the financial institutions aware of and prepare for the climate change related risk. So this is the main purpose of this one. So even though in some cases we got wrong numbers, but we try to be accurate, and if we provide some number, then it can be better than no number. So this is the rationale behind the climate stress test. And the Bank of Korea is not the first, even though we started early, but as far as I know, the formal climate stress test performed by central bank is started about 7 or 8 years ago, and one of the first is the Dutch Central Bank's climate stress test, and Bank of England and ECB and Bank of France actually followed it this way. So these days, the more than 20 central banks actually perform the climate stress test, and they got the estimate for their own. So let me just skip this one. So let me briefly explain the concept and then each steps to take to perform the climate stress test. And so there are several differences between the conventional stress test typically performed in the financial sector and the climate stress test we are talking about today. So in case of the climate stress test, we have a problem, which is the lack of the detailed data at the stable level for the purpose of analysis, especially for the firm level data. So, for example, the carbon-related data is not abundant like financial data, like the balance sheet variables. So in terms of the frequency and in terms of the detailedness, we have a problem, the lack of the detailed data. And another challenge is to model the dynamic interaction between the macroeconomy and climate change. So economics actually has focusing just on the macroeconomy, but we add another big complication called the climate change. So it's very challenging task. So sometimes we simplify assumptions, which is not satisfying in some sense. So and so the main problem is that there's the lack of models that sufficiently model both the climate change and macroeconomic sectors. So that's the current stage. So we need to work more harder about this thing. And NGF has said that currently there is no single model that cover the full range of required output. So that means that sometimes we need to kind of eclectic approach that borrow some models from some other research and borrow some numbers from other researchers, something like that. So this is the current stage. And so let me just show the steps to take for the climate stress test. So this is a little bit similar to the typical stress test. So mainly it consists of the 4 or 5 steps. The first one is the setting of the scenarios. So we need to deciding the scope and scenarios. So we need to decide the scope. The scope means that you want to analyze the global economy or each country or each industry or household level or zip code level or something like that. So once we decide the scope, then we need to decide on the scenarios, typically the transition risk and fiscal risk. So this is the what if process. And second step is that according to each scenario, then what would be the responses of the key macroeconomic variables? So the key economic variables include the responses of GDP and interest rate and carbon emission in this sense and other inflation and some other things. And in the second step, we use models. In terms of models, we use the IAM and DSE and CZE is the computable general equilibrium model. And so as I said, we have some unsatisfying aspect in modeling. So for example, IAM is rich in modeling climate change and nature system, but they lack the number of macroeconomic variables. And in opposite, in DSE model, this is the typically used by economists. So it is full of the economic variables, but it lacks the variables in climate change. And CZE is typically used in international trade. And I have once tried the CZE model, but I think it can be just my case. But the CZE model in practical usage, this CZE model often fails to converge and fails to produce some numbers. So I think that the combination of IAM and DSE is the promising way. And third step is the industry analysis. So once we get the numbers for the response of key macroeconomic variables. Then the third step is about then what would happen to industry level. So what would happen to transportation industry and what would happen to the metal manufacturing industry. So, and then we actually calculate the impact on stock price and net profit and bond price, some of things. And in doing so, we need a linkage between the macroeconomy and industry. So typically, we use the input-output table, which shows the connection between the various industries. And the final step is the financial market impact. So once we get the responses of macroeconomic variables, and then we get the numbers for the industrial level response, then we actually examine then what would happen to financial institutions that lend the money to those companies in the industry. So in this step, we use some Golden's dividend growth model and logic probability and some other things. Then we calculate the PD, the probability of default, and then we calculate the bank capital ratio and some other things. So this is the final target. And in our analysis, today's our main target is the BIS capital ratio. So I will show you the later. So once we just go through this figure, so just let me briefly just mention each step. So as I said, and in the first step, we need to set the scope and scenarios. So we need to the unit of analysis, and also we need to set the time horizon. So Dutch Central Bank and Norway Central Bank use the 5-year scenario, and Denmark Central Bank is very ambitious. They have like the 80-year time horizon, and in BOK case, we use the 10-year scenario. And this is the scenario example. So I will not go over this one, but let me just check the one thing from the Dutch Central Bank case, which is very similar to ours. So actually they consider two kinds of shocks. One is policy shocks, which is more close to transition risk. So what if the carbon price per ton is raised to $100 globally? And another shock is technological shock. So what if we have the advancement in renewable energy? And plus, what if we consider the stranded asset problem? And also they consider the combination of these two shocks. So this is kind of typical scenarios taken by the central bank. So as you can see here, other central banks use a very similar approach. And NGFS actually, as I said, is kind of the gathering of central bank to address climate change. So these days, the NGFS itself actually perform the climate stress test, and they provide the scenarios. And this is kind of the norm in central bank community these days. So actually, another study by Bank of Korea actually follow these scenarios. And step 2 and 3, as I said, this is the modeling part. So once we set the scenario, and if the scenario happens, then what happens to the macroeconomic variables and what happens to each industry? This is the step 2 and 3. And as I said, we have a long way to go about modeling the climate change in terms of in the viewpoint of the economists, because the IAM is very rich in modeling nature system, but the economic sector is poorly modeled. And also the losses are expressed as non-economic variables, like so we need some nominal amount, like a few dollars or something like that, but some IAM model actually price the number which does not make economic sense directly. And as I keep saying that so far our model have very smaller macro variables in terms of the IAM. And step 4, step 4 is about the gauging the impact on financial sector. And there are two approaches, broadly speaking. One is top down and the other is bottom up. So top down is so central banks actually do everything. So central bank set the scenario and collect the data and get the numbers and then distribute the numbers to the private institutions to let them know that what serious risk we are facing or something like that. And bottom is just the opposite. So central bank just set the scenario and decide the key variables to look at. And then each private financial institutions perform their own climate test and report about. So that's the bottom approach. So, and what we did is the top down. So I will show this one. So an industry level analysis is possible. So actually we kind of distribute the macro shocks to each industry. So we use typically input-output table and also the transitional vulnerability factor. So we actually follow the approach of the Dutch Central Bank. So I will show the concept of the transition vulnerability factor pretty soon. And so step 4 is the formal the steps for the climate stress test, and actually we increase the step 5, so exchange opinions and evaluation. So because this is the main purpose of the climate stress to raise the awareness of the seriousness of climate change to the financial institutions. So there's some examples. So for example, in UK and France, they actually make the public the aggregate numbers, and in terms of the entity level numbers, they just report they deliver the numbers to each financial institutions to prepare for the climate change. So this is the one way to actually share the information gathered from climate stress test. So this is the preliminary knowledge about what is about climate test, and I will just briefly talk about what we do for the BOK's climate testing. So we perform actually it's kind of just scenario analysis, and we did these things. The first one is that we calculate the transition vulnerability factor for each industry using the input-output table and carbon data. And using this one, we are prepared to estimate the different impact on each industry. And using the model, we basically use two models. One is that NIGEM, and I will show that. And the other one is the typical environmental DSE model. And we estimate the response of key macro variables depending on each scenario. And then we convert that chart into industry level and calculate the changes in stock and bond price of each industry, and also the bank's credit and market losses. And the final step, we calculate the BI's capital adequacy ratio. So this is bank capital ratio. So we need to check after following the scenarios, and we need to check the BI's capital ratio is still above the regulatory minimum. So that is the key point here. So let me just briefly explain the transition vulnerability factor. So it's a little bit complicated, but I will just skip over these equations. So I will just talk about the concept of the TBF, and the central bank actually invented this concept, and we slightly modified this concept. And so what is TBF? Then you can say like this one: how much direct and indirect emissions are generated in each industry to create 1 unit of added value. So we actually calculate the TVA as kind of the how much direct and indirect emission to make the $1 million revenue. So this, and adjusting to the overall average of the economy. So why we do this? Then there's some. So firstly, we need a linkage between the macroeconomy and each industry. That's the one motivation. And also we want to consider the indirect emission as well. So for example, if making tire make the carbon emission, and this tire is used for car making, then the carbon emission for making tire is captured as indirect emission for car making. So actually we actually allot the carbon emission for tire making onto the indirect emission of the car making. So this is the concept TVA. So there are some advantages. So as I said, we can also consider the indirect emission, and also there's no double counting. So actually it's kind of the redistributing the carbon emission of the whole economy onto each industry, considering the indirect emission and considering the linkage between industries. Some materials from one industry can be used for input, or some industry production can be used as output or something like this. So we consider all these production network presently in input-output network. And in calculating TVA, sadly, we do not consider scope 3 because it is not the accurate measure at the time. So this is the example of the TVA, and sorry about this Korean letters. So actually, during the last week, actually I tried to convert it in every Korean into English, but it's like the running the whole model again. So actually I fixed it some part, but here this A part is the carbon emission by industry, and this third column, the third row shows that the TVA. And as you can see here, this industry is the transportation. So once you can see this transportation, in terms of carbon emission, the transportation actually emit lots of carbon, but when you take into account the indirect emission, then transportation is not that bad in terms of the TVA. So that means that the carbon emission from transportation actually used for production of other industry. So actually we want to consider this. This is the main motivation of TVA. And this is the more detailed industry classification. And once you got the input-output table and industry level carbon data, then you can calculate this TVA. And I think that this is the better this provides a better picture than the just physical the amount of carbon emission. And this is the important part. So we consider 3 shocks: the policy shocks, technology shocks, and combination of these 2 shocks, which is we call dual shocks. So policy shock is made to achieve the 37% reduction in greenhouse gas emission by 2013 compared to business as usual at the time. So this is actually kind of the government guideline. So we actually made the scenarios to comply with the government guidelines. And we also add the technology shock, and this is to achieve the 20% renewable energy share by 2013. So this is the 10-year time horizon. And to achieve this target, we need to come up with some more detailed scenario. So for the policy shock, we consider 3 scenarios. So one is that South Korea alone imposed $1.8 per ton starting in 2021, and increasing by $1.8 per quarter over the next decade. And second scenario is the all countries impose $2 and then increase by $2 over the 10 years. And third policy considers the all country impose the $50 per ton. So this is more radical one, but I will show the result. And second one is tectonic shock. So achieve the this target, we consider this one. So like this. So it's about the advancement in renewable energy technology, and another thing is that we consider the strandedness problem. So this tectonic shock is good thing in terms of the advancement of renewable technology, and better thing in terms of the stranded set. And we also combine these two shocks. So this graph, actually this left one shows that what would be the carbon tax path if we take these scenarios. So as I said, the third one is the all country impose $50 right now. So it shows that this green line. So this is the $50. And first and second scenario is that we start from $1.8, $2, and then we increase it over time. So this is the carbon price path in the model. And I will show this one. Then what happens to key macroeconomic variables if we take this carbon price path? So this blue one is the what if South Korea alone impose $1.8 and increase it by $1.8 for the next 10 years, then real GDP actually declines over time, and it did not recover. And the interesting is the third scenario. So what if we all country impose $50 at once and just keep that level, then the initial shock is far bigger. So in terms of real GDP, we have very big shock, which means that we lose about almost 1.5% of the GDP in 2 or 3 years. So it's kind of the severe recession like that, but it recovers different from the scenario 1 and 2. So it means that, as many people say, that the earlier the action, the better the outcome we have. So this actually model shows that the result as well. And this is the time path of carbon emission. So actually we devised this each scenario to get the target. So in 2013, all three scenarios actually meet the carbon target. So this is the calculation from model. And we also look at the inflation and short-term interest rate. So in case of the third scenario, the decline in GDP initially and big jump in inflation and big jump in short-term interest rate, it is kind of a typical picture of the supply shock, like the sudden rise in oil price or something like that. So imposed carbon tax will play like the supply shock. The typical example is oil price shock. And so we can do the same thing for the tectonic shock, and also we can do the same thing for the dual shock. So we can actually get these numbers for each scenario, and then the next step is to convert this macroeconomic impact into industry level and then the financial sector. So we did this one, and this is a very technical part, which include the very complicated formulas. So I will just skip by this one. So what we do is that with some assumptions, we calculate the stock price reaction, and in this step, the TBF plays some important role, because each industry has different values of TBF, and we actually model so that the macroeconomic impact will unfold differently upon each industry depending on the values of TVF. So we actually we interpret this TVF like the beta, the risk sensitivity in CAPM model. So if you have the high TVF value, then you are exposed to more higher risk in terms of climate change. So we calculate the stock price reaction, and this is the changes in stock price in each industry, and also we can calculate the sorry about this Korean letters. So these things are the industry name, and this blue one is policy shock. This orange one is the techline shock, and this gray one is the dual shock. So we can calculate the response of each shock on each industry. And in the same way, we calculate the change in bond prices.
I'm gonna go back.
So this is we actually adopt the typical methodology used in the credit risk modeling. So we can do the same thing here, and also we also can change the default probability in bank loans. So if a bank lend much on the industry with lots of stranded asset, then if the risk of climate change emerges, then probably that industry with lots of stranded asset will be hit harder than the loans to those industry will be more likely to be non-performing. And then the bank capital ratio will decline following the result. And this is what we do. And when we calculate the impact on industry level different responses to banking sector, we consider two kinds of losses. One is the market loss, and the other is credit loss. And market loss is from the change in asset prices. And credit loss is the change in value of loans and bond. So this is typically from default or non-performing loans. So let me show you the main result. So this is the actually our most important result. So the baseline is the BAU scenario. So we do nothing to tackle with the climate stress as the climate change, and there are scenarios. So the three policy shocks and techline shocks and the three kinds of dual shocks. And the regulatory minimum for the bank capital ratio is 10.5% at the time. So this ratio is the same still. And then we calculate the BI's capital ratio for each scenario. And this orange line, or the orange area, means that the loss from our scenario. So as we can expect, this reduction in BI's ratio is larger for the dual shocks because it is combined two shocks. And also, this C3 dual shock ratio is the biggest shock. But even in the case, we experienced the almost 3 percentage point of decline in bank capital ratio, but still we are well above the regulatory minimum. So when you obtain this number, so we are kind of relieved, and even though we actually consider very harsh scenarios about climate change, but this kind of loss can be manageable inside the banking sector. But the precondition is that we need to prepare this one. So this is the main result, and we also use another model typically used by economists. So we call the New Keynesian model to check the robustness of our result. So we do the same thing, similar things, and then the result is that when you use this model, then it gives the more optimistic numbers, but the direction of change is almost the same. So we actually obtain the similar message from the climate test. Okay, and so here's the summary and the future test. So according to our result, so while some industry with lots of stranded assets will experience losses of the constant magnitude, the overall banking sector will experience manageable losses if preemptive measures are taken. So as I show, so this kind of reduction will happen following these scenarios, but this magnitude can be manageable because even if we lose this part, but still we are actually almost 2 percentage points above the regulatory minimum. And I want to emphasize that do not believe these numbers in exact sense, because that as Bolton said, the main purpose of climate test is not blindly believe, but its main purpose is to make central banks and supervisory authorities and financial institutions aware of the risks about the climate risk. So this is the main point. So following the step 5, if we distribute this result to the private financial institutions, then they can imagine what would happen if the climate risk unfolds. Then they will prepare about these things in terms of rebalancing the portfolios or some other things. So that's the main purpose of the climate test. And we there are many things we need to do. So for example, we need to consider longer term horizon. So for our example, we consider only 10-year horizon, but we need to extend this time horizon. And another thing is that, as I said, the DSC models typically used by economists lack the number of variables about the climate change. So we need to make it rich in terms of nature system and climate change. And also, we just focus on the banking sector, but as already know, the climate change impose more serious risk to the insurance industry. So actually, we need to combine the insurance and pension fund and their interconnectedness. So this is the another good way to go. And I'm the former central banker, so I think this question is very important. So should addressing climate change be the part of the central bank's mandate? So it's like that. So typically the Fed in US have a mandate, 2 mandate. We call it dual mandate. One is the price stability and maximum employment. And for the Bank of Korea, we have kind of the hierarchical mandate. The first one is the price stability, and second is the financial stability. And this question asks that if we need to add another mandate about climate change. And some say yes, and some say no. And my answer for now is no. So for now, I think that the central bank should focus on what is going on with the climate change, and will respond to the extent that climate change affect the variables mandated, related to mandate, like the inflation or something. So if the climate change unfolds and inflation goes up, then central bank should respond. But I don't think that we need to include the climate change as a mandate, because that the climate change is a very, very uncertain area. So even the scientists do not have a full understanding of climate change. And what about the economists? So if the central bank take this very uncertain thing and use it for policy making, then probably the central bankers will be likely to make many wrong prediction or mistakes. Then it will result in losing the credibility of central bank, and the central bank can be impotent because it loses the credibility. So for then what should do about climate change? Then I think that this kind of climate test is a very good example how the central bank should engage in addressing climate change. So support the research about climate change related to economic variables, and also and just monitoring what's going on about climate change, but not making as a mandate. So this is just my personal opinion for now. Okay, so this is it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume, for sharing this interesting work of study, and also sharing your view on the role of the central bank in terms of addressing the climate change. We only have 5 minutes left, so before we open a short window for the Q&A, maybe I think this is a question that most of the audience might have. You mentioned that, like some of the, this is more about the technical question about the study. You mentioned there are other various models that are being applied and used by different institutions. And then in this study, we also did use NISM and also the DSGE. How those models become different, and then in your view, what are the pros and cons of using like such specific model, and is there any possibility that we can align those models so that we can have more comprehensive overview on climate risk analysis?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and this is my concern as well. So as I said, we have the very good model about climate change, which is called the IAM. So as I said, it is very detailed and complicated model about nature system. And they started to include the economic variables as well these days, but still, the modeling about economic sector is insufficient. And in the opposite, the DSC model is very rich model in terms of describing the economic behavior, but we do not have the very rich modeling about climate change. So for example, in the simplest setting, how we consider the impact of climate change in the economy model, then we just assume that the loss function. So loss function is very simple. So we just borrow the numbers from the research by scientists. So what if one Celsius degree increases, then what will happen to GDP? Then we just got the numbers, to borrow the numbers without some other more optimizing behavior or something. So it's very eclectic at this stage. So I think that so we as the following the suggestion by NGFS. So for now we need to be eclectic. So borrow the models and borrow the numbers from other research, but our future task is to enrich the details of climate change into the economic models. So that is the way we need to go.
Thank you. And then I have a question from the chat from Ben Jimmer. So I think Ben, please interrupt me if I am incorrectly interpreting your question. So the question here is that Kyung, you mentioned rather than climate change be part of the central bank's mandate, you said the central bank should have a different role into play. So then the question leads to what are then in your perspective, what are the roles and responsibility that the central bank should take in terms of the climate change? I think you partly mentioned at the end of your presentation, And also, what is your, like, what are the specific roles? And then, like, do you think that market-driven approaches like can be better or can be more effective in terms of, like a central bank regulates and, like intervene the markets on the climate change or the managing the climate risks?
Yeah, so that's a very good question as well. And then 1 month ago, the Bank of Korea was holding the conference about climate change and central banking in Seoul. And at the end of the panel discussion, we have a kind of heated debate about what should the central bank do. And one extreme answer is that we do not have to care about climate change. We are central bank, so we just focus on the inflation and employment sometimes. And the other end is that we should intervene. One example is that addressing climate change as a mandate. And my current position is just in between. And the reason is that if I take the position of making it as mandate, then as I said, we have some danger. So let me just take the one example. So let me take the example of the economic forecasting. So every central bank makes the economic forecasting about GDP, future GDP and other things, and they announced it. So many central banks do that in the semi-annual basis or quarterly basis. So for the case of the Bank of Korea, we actually switched from semi-annual, the 6 months, to quarterly, the 3 months. And there are pros and cons. So and I can accept the quarterly forecasting, but what if we do monthly economic forecasting? So in some sense, we can think that it would be good because the economic agent have more information about economic forecasting monthly basis. But as we know that it's very difficult to do the good economic forecasting. So if we do the higher frequency economic forecasting, that means that it will be more likely to make the errors or make the wrong economic forecasting. Then you will lose the credibility. And I think the same thing applies to climate change. So as I said, the economist does not much about climate change, even compared to scientists. And if we take the very, very uncertain and unpredictable variable as our mandate and make the policy according to that variable, then we are more likely to make the wrong predictions and make the wrong policies. So for now, until we accumulate the sufficient knowledge about what will happen to climate change, then the good position is just to take the middle. So do not making as a mandate, but we should monitor what would happen to climate change and what would happen to researching in climate change. And also, the central bank actually can sponsor the research on the economic impact of climate change. And that's a good thing. And also, this kind of the climate stress is another good thing that central bank can do for our society. So for now, so I do not say that the central bank should forget about climate change. The central bank should care about climate change, but I oppose that making as a mandate because that it's kind of impossible job for now, and it will lose the credibility. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much, Ki-young. I think because your previous role as a monetary policy board, I think we are having a lot of questions about, like what's the role, and then also in this specific time of the situation, like we have a lot of question about the role of the public central bank or the public sector role in mitigating climate change and so on. So I think Professor Ki-young Park has shared his perspective on this. Thank you. We are actually running out of time, so unfortunately, we cannot open for the full Q&A discussion. However, Kiyoung is approachable through email, and also
Yes.
you'll be able to find those work that Kiyoung and I did with the Central Bank of Korea. So please also feel free to look for those resources. I will also put this up on Stanford SFI website. Yeah, so thank you for joining for today's session. Those are from Stanford or the US, later in the afternoon and also early morning from Korea. So thank you very much. And we'll look forward to see you next month. All right. Please give a big applause to Professor Kiyoung Park for sharing his work and then speaking today. Thank you, Kiyoung.
Thank you so much.